welcome back to the SaaS community channel where we share SaaS stories and learn from each other. And welcome back, Ram.
Hey, Gwen, thanks a lot for having me again.
For those who did not watch previous episodes, which you absolutely should go and watch, Ram was on his channel about a month ago to talk about how Confluent solved the cluster provisioning problem. And we invited him again to talk about another very common SaaS problem, which is getting users to actually use your product. It's surprisingly not as trivial as it sounds when I say it that way.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think, oftentimes what happens is in these companies, especially when you're product-led growth, what I mean by product-led growth is basically when you're essentially trying to market your product, and then you have, in our case, let's say in Confluence case, this was developers trying to essentially come to your website, trying to use the product on their own without even talking to us, signing up, and then starting to use the product and so on and so forth. In such product, go-to-market strategy where you have this product-led growth, the job of making a customer successful does not end with just signing them up to the product, which is typically what marketing does, right? Their basic metric is, hey, did I hit my sign-up goal? Now, that's awesome. You did hit your sign-up goal, but what next? Did that really translate to business success? It requires a lot of steps after that, right? And that's kind of where we started with, which is, hey, we have done a reasonable job on the sign-up side, but we're not really seeing the customer success on the other side of the funnel.
Yeah, so basically the business came to engineering and said, hey, we know how to do a lot of stuff outside the product, marketing, sales, etc. But now we need engineering to help us bring all those things into the product so they will actually get us to the goal, which is people getting value and using the product.
Right. So the way I'll define this is essentially a funnel activation problem. So the way this would work is, let's take the example of Confluent as the product, right? And then just walk through the product journey, as well as how all the other people in the company, like sales, customer, your execs, everybody are also kind of tied to this whole complex piece of funnel activation problem.
Okay, that's a lot. So step by step.
Yeah. So to start with, in the product itself, if you look at it, the user signs up, and then typically what they do is they end up creating a cluster. Like say, in our case, it was a Kafka cluster. And the next step you want the user to do is to kind of produce some data into the cluster. You want them to consume some data from the cluster. And once they do this, you kind of call them as onboarding activated because they've gone through your quick start, very simple steps. And you'd be surprised how many people just still, don't end up becoming onboarding activated because they found a bunch of issues with their quick starts. But then you end up doing that and you start producing some data, consuming some data, you're onboarding activated. And then you kind of started loving the product, you started doing more research, you read the docs, and then you start having a use case where you really want to go build a real cluster and start building an app against it. And then you start generating a lot of data continuously for a period of time. Let's say, if a customer produced and consumed data consistently for a period of 1 week, then let's say they were production activated or an active organization. An active organization means they've gone through the onboarding, they've started using it for a real case, and they've been able to consistently push data for a period of time. Now, this is the product funnel that you want your customer to go through. And the reason why you want to do this is because in a product-led company, especially, and cloud companies, your revenue recognition, right, happens only when your customer uses the product. It's not good enough if you just sign up a large contract value, right, for a year and sign them up and hope that things will just work. What you really have to do, and that's when the hard work actually starts, which is after you sign the customer up, either they came through and found your product and started using it organically, or you signed up a deal, but it doesn't matter. What you really fundamentally need is to kind of make sure that the customer is activated through the whole funnel and they start producing data for a longer period of time. Because once they start consuming, more of your of your infrastructure and starting to produce and consume data, they start generating more revenue per organization, right? So that's very important.
Yeah, so basically it's obviously important in the abstract, but there were probably like specific people who really needed to know the details of how customers are successfully navigating this journey for their own role. So
yeah, so
they wanted the same data. Did you help to kind of give everyone something else? How did how did you gather requirements for something like that?
Yeah, so I think let's walk through different personas in a company, right? You have the developer who is kind of building the product, and then they work typically with a product manager. Now, the product manager is really interested and owns the funnel after sign up. Now, sign up typically is what marketing cares about, and then the PM, usually this could be the growth PM in your company, or even your CEO, might be really interested in making sure that the customer funnel activation happens to make them production active. So the developer pretty much works with the PM very closely, trying to figure out what that funnel looks like and how do we activate them and how do we make the customers be successful.
Yeah, I have to stop you here before you move to another persona, because I just remembered a very vivid memory. And you were there probably early 2019, something like that, where we had an offsite and product and engineering together. And the exercise was for all of us to go through the quick start documentation of Confluent Cloud. I completely failed, even though I know something about Kafka. I think you ran the cloud org. I think you may be slightly more successful.
Right.
But why did we have to do it? Why wasn't it obvious from the data that something in our quick start is
it was wrong,
broken?
Yeah, great question. I think glad that you were able to remember that. So yeah, that's exactly the point. The point is that when you're not really focused on the metric of making sure you want to convert these customers successfully through this journey, through your funnel, you never, first of all, to start with, you have no insights in terms of where the customer is in this journey. You had no metrics to figure out are they successful or not successful, and you had no testing in the first place that essentially executed this onboarding flow to figure out if it actually is working in the first place. So what happens is when organically you just keep making a lot of changes to the product, you start building all these different flows in your product, and soon enough you realize that the quick start is broken. You don't really understand and have insights into the product in terms of the customer journey. And you kind of end up with that state where we all had to go sit in a room and really try it out to just empathize with the problem, so that we ended up actually taking it much more seriously after that.
Yeah, so now you instrumented all those metrics, so product can take it seriously, but you mentioned earlier, product were not the only people interested in how successful it is.
Yeah, so I did speak about developers and product managers. And if you look at it, this same onboarding data in terms of how the customer is doing, where are they in this journey, what's the usage consumption in the product, is also very important for your execs, obviously, because they really need to understand which are the organizations that are active, how are we doing in terms of funnel conversions, and how's the business, how's the consumption going in terms of revenue and all of that. The other side is you have all the sales folks who really need to understand the customer better in terms of the usage and have they onboarded in the first place, are they started to push data in the first place into the cluster, so that they can decide whether they have to go to the customer and what conversation they need to have with them. For example, do you actually go help them in terms of tactically getting to the next step in the onboarding, or you try to cross-sell by essentially, or upsell by selling more products because they've been successful with using one product and you want to sell a second product. So that's the sales persona, right? And then the support persona might want to know this because they want to essentially know if something went wrong when they were onboarding and they saw some errors. You want to proactively support the customer by going to them and reaching out to them rather than customer reaching out to you. It's always a great experience from a customer success standpoint of view.
Even the reverse, right? If a customer reached out to me with a question, it makes a lot of difference. Did they already successfully go through onboarding and activated versus someone who was not yet successful? Like, it's a very different interaction.
Exactly. And I did want to bring up one other thing that you made me remind, right? Which is, how does the customer know that, let's say they're taking a sequence of steps, how do they even know that the product is even working in the first place in Confluent, right? So you produce some data, for all you know that the data might just be getting lost, right? So this is where we also had to actually provide all these usage data to the customers in forms of APIs and through a dashboard where, honestly speaking, Confluent was kind of a data intensive SaaS app, it was a SaaS app, but it had lots of data metrics and observability aspects for the customer. So they get to understand what is happening with their system. And in some cases, the true success of a customer is when they are able to figure out whether the problem is on their side or on the Confluent side, right? And they're able to come to us if there is an issue, right? So both actually works on.
Yeah, actually, and Dustin, who was on this channel a few weeks back, and he was like, explains that customers were hungry for this data.
Right,
Like
right,
they wanted
exactly.
to know more and more about essentially their users,
Yeah,
their
exactly.
usage.
Yeah,
I remember like, don't you know what you're doing in the product? I mean, you're the one using it, but no, they wanted to see it in the application. That
that's
was
right.
the
That's
huge
right.
deal.
And then finally, just to complete that discussion, the marketing folks also wanted to know the usage data because for a long period of time, they were sending some campaigns to the user, which had no relevance to where the customer was in the product.
Oh, yeah.
But ideally, what they wanted to do was to send some kind of relevant emails to them, talking about, hey, you're done X, Y, Z in the product. Would you like to do something else, or can you take the next step, right? And something that is more relevant to the customer was needed. And the way you do that is by getting all this customer information to the marketing's favorite tool.
Yeah, that was, by the way, my pet peeve when I sign up to a product and I didn't start using it because I know people are busy.
Yeah.
And the next thing you get is an email with like a crazy advanced use case that you just feel like an email because you don't even understand the email. It's just kind of like, what are those people
Yep.
doing?
Exactly.
They
Exactly.
know I'm on their system. Why are they treating me like spammers
That's
essentially?
right.
So it can be very putting off to a user. So what you're basically describing to me as someone who managed some projects, it just sounds like almost the project from hell. Like the stakes are very high. It's almost like the survival and growth of the business. And gazillion different people at different roles have a gazillion different things that they need to achieve in their own special ways. How did engineering manage to wrangle all of this together?
Yep. Yep. So see, the structure that we had to build all of this, one thing was the actual database with all these entities that were defined, which is essentially the metadata associated with everything in your product, like your cluster information, your user information, and so on and so forth, right? And then we also had the actual data plane, like the Kafka cluster itself. That was what the customer was using to produce and consume data from. Now, usage for us is a combination of all the API calls they do on the metadata and all the produce and consume they do on the data plane.
What
In
about
totality,
clicks in the UI? Like if they didn't actually save anything, would like this seems like also really important data.
yes. So basically, all these events that in terms of customer actions that we generated, was essentially another thing that we had to store in terms of all user activity data in our system. And the other thing the developers had to do is think about, hey, first off, let's first solve the product use case problem, which is we needed two requirements on the product side. One was build enough data sets that you can show in the app in terms of usage for the customers. And then also trying to figure out how do we define this funnel in the product so that we can make sure that the customer succeeds. So the way we solved this problem was we ended up building, the very famous data pipelines. So we kind of did all the CDC, change data capture from our database. We also had all our Kafka clusters emit all the usage events. This all fed into our Kafka pipelines. And then we had to kind of build we had probably the largest Druid cluster in the world at that point, at some point in time, where we had to essentially build it out, manage it, consume all this usage data, build all these analytics sets, right? That the product needs. And then front end had to spend a lot of time building all these charts and metrics in terms of how to render that, how do you make it really performant, how do you essentially do pagination with the Druid system and being able to kind of automatically expose all this information. We also had to build an entire rules-based engine that was driven off of this metrics data, usage data, so that it was not enough if customers finds out by logging into your UI. It is also important that we can proactively let our support team know when they should go and talk to their customers in case like, some usage data was impacted or some metrics in the system was impacted because of the server side or the customer side. So that was essentially.
We also generated those emails to salespeople, right? Like how much did your customers use it?
Yes. So that was. I'll come to the other persona.
Oh.
This is just only focused
Product.
on what was needed in the product to show those metrics, and then in addition to that, the developers had to go instrument the front end as well as our apps, any other apps the customer was interfacing with, to emit these events so that we can define these onboarding funnel in terms of that I talked about early on, which is sign up to onboarding to production active. You have to define this funnel, and then we had to have a growth team that went and actually optimized this funnel by looking at the data set, right? So that is what developers had to do. Now, there was one more thing developers had to do, which is, as I said, there are also other people in the company who are interested in this data set, like sales, marketing, customer support, execs. So what do you do there? So that's when there's a pretty long journey to essentially get all these data sets again built out into pipelines, and eventually trying to, our data science team and our data engineering team trying to build, they had Airflow systems where they were defining these workflows to dump this data from Kafka to, BigQuery, basically our data warehouse, and then spend considerable time taking all this data set and building lots of metrics dashboards that are pretty standard for most SaaS companies. But we anyway had to build all of that, right? So, but by doing this, there are tons of challenges because, these pipelines that,
like there were even stages to it. Like very early on, I remember that uploading data to the data warehouse from the production database was literally a script that ran on his machine, and if he wasn't around, we did not have data in the data warehouse. So it will be really interesting to hear how it matured from Joshua's running a script to something that is, did it ever become really like production quality, or always a struggle?
Yeah, like any other startup, we started with a script. It was the most, it's kind of unreliable, obviously, because we had no observability. We didn't know when it was failing. We tried our best. It was kind of scanning the whole DB and just dumping it into a BigQuery, which meant that we'll have some kind of like performance issues on the DB.
It was taking logs.
Right? Yeah, so that happened as the first version. This was even before we even had a data science team, or data engineering team to do anything. And then after that, what happened was we realized, okay, this is not going to work. We need something more reliable. The challenge though is the script was also only solving one part of the problem. It was only looking at data from our database, but there was also all the data that was required from our Druid cluster, from our actual products in terms of usage metrics and other metrics that you need in terms of, errors and all of that. So it was not actually a scalable approach. So that's when we like, okay, the next iteration was, let's start thinking about things like all of these things as events. Now, when we started thinking about them as events, we had to think about, hey, how does the database generate events? Then we had to think about change data capture. There is no way we had any bandwidth to do that. So we decided, okay, let's not do that right now. Let's still continue to use the script on the database side. And we spent some time on the Druid side by taking all this data that we have through the Kafka pipeline that came from all the data plane clusters, and started pushing that through another Kafka cluster that the data warehouse team can use. And then they were able to like consume from that Kafka cluster and start essentially dumping it into BigQuery. And then the third aspect to this was essentially metrics that the product was essentially reporting. These were like Datadog operational metrics. And this was not essentially in our analytics, real-time analytics pipeline. And we had to figure out how to essentially dump that data, which meant some Datadog integration, which
I
is kind
think
of
we
doing.
never figured that part out.
Yeah, I don't think we ended up having a good pipeline to do that, but there was lots of interest to do that. I think there was obviously some level of prototype to go query Datadog to get that data, but it never happened. But this is kind of how it worked in terms of the second iteration. And then eventually we ended up saying, okay, let's go spend time building the CDC pipelines, getting all this data from our databases, making sure we can push it into all these pipelines. But that is just the start of the actual solution, because we still were breaking the pipelines and the data set all the time, because the data schemas get changed on the developer side, and they had no clue where these pipelines were getting routed to. And surprisingly, they'll get an escalation saying something is broken right from the big data warehouse side. And it was very hard to even take care of that, because we had no bandwidth. The developers bandwidth was just focused on building the product and supporting the customers. So some of these pipelines used to stay broken for more than what we wanted, sometimes multiple days, when you really wanted to like have them fixed in matter
And
of
this
minutes.
could basically impact the timing. Like if you needed a quarterly report before the executives met with the board, for example, and if the pipeline is broken, it's kind of a minor catastrophe.
Yes, and even more than that, imagine there was an actual data loss due to, like revenue loss, versus a loss due to the pipeline being broken. It is impossible to like even identify that. So you're kind of running blind and not even knowing if there was an impact to the business revenue.
And at
So
some point, people stop taking the metric seriously if it just keeps breaking. Like, oh, you had 50% drop in revenue, it's probably not real.
that's right. So and then so this happened. So we had I would say a roughly broken pipeline, but it at least tried to do what it was meant to do, which is to dump data eventually into the warehouse. But then oftentimes all these other people in the company, like sales, marketing, support, did not end up spending all their time on the warehouse. Right? They had their own tools, like customer 360 tools and marketing campaign tools and so on and so forth. So then we had to think about how do you get that data from the warehouse um, to all these other tooling systems like that other people in the company use. So we had to build like these, people call this the reverse ETL nowadays, but we had to go figure out how to build all these pipelines back to these tools so that salesperson can look at the data and decide what they have to do with the customers, or support can decide what they have to do with the customers.
And those tools were chosen by sales and by support without talking to engineers. How easy will it be for you to actually give me my data? They kind of took for granted that the data will magically show up somehow.
Right. So this is the other challenge, right? Which is if you just draw out the lineage of a data set in a company, it starts from your database into some pipelines and into multiple pipelines sometimes, and then into your data warehouse. And then from there into the tools that these other people use, like sales, marketing. And oftentimes there is no guarantees, end-to-end guarantees here, because the decisions of using tools are completely decentralized. Each person decides to use their tool. Some of them might just use it from just searching on the web and just downloading some tool and starting to use that. And God knows what format they wanted. Is that even compatible there? But what happens is if we change something in production, it had this downstream impact. And sometimes it was not even known this was broken for multiple weeks. And then after 2 weeks, somebody will come and tell us, hey, this is broken for us. Can you fix it immediately? And we would have to go back to figure out when did we even make the change and how do we fix it and so on and so forth. So I think no matter what tools we used, this problem was hard because we ended up using multiple tools. So there was nothing that was really controlling the schema ownership end to end.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about how important it was for it to be reliable and how hard it was to make it reliable. And so I'm just trying to think about monitoring for something that is that dispersed and sometimes gets added by different business functions, or even testing. Like suppose that I made a change to Kafka. I really want to make sure that it does not break the ability of sales to target the correct leads. Yep. How would I go about testing something like that?
Yeah, I think, I don't really have a good answer for the existing infrastructure that we had, because inherently it was hard for a few reasons. One was we were all doing work that was not our core competency, right? So it was just very hard to get bandwidth from developers or any other people in the company to make that whole pipeline and that whole structure work really, really well. Given enough amount of time, like let's assume infinite time, you can make any of these things work by just spending a lot of time writing tests at different points in time in the pipelines, having good data ownership across the entire company, making sure there was a on-call, internal on-call, apart from just external on-call, where if things broke, you knew who was going to get paged, and then they kind of act on it. There's so much to do to just get your internal infrastructure running. And this is also even after us using some of the off-the-shelf tools, right? This is not something like we ended up building our own warehouse or we ended up building our own connectors. A lot of these things were used or off the shelf, but it was almost felt like you're given a suite of tools to go figure out, and then you have to go kind of mix and match all of these things. So there is no tried and tested way, because there are like n different ways to do these things out there.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, right? Because you used a lot of off-the-shelf tools picked by a lot of different people for different reasons, writing a test for it. Like there is no test framework for I Googled stuff up and picked something.
That's right.
It's just a really hard problem in its own right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So if you obviously, and it was obviously an evolving system, like every few weeks, few months, someone in the business needs something, a tool was picked, another pipeline was added. So it was never really architected from first principles, from the fundamentals to be a great system. Do you have like some thoughts on what is needed there?
Yeah, see, my take on this is, I think you tweeted about this as well recently. I think lots of systems will come up and data systems will come up. Even SaaS apps will come up, but the challenge is that none of these systems can become your state of record or a single system that you can use for everything in your company, because fundamentally they're built for different use cases and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. But I think we have to essentially innovate above these systems, which is essentially think about how a single data platform for SaaS can fundamentally bring all of these things together. And I'll give a little bit into insight into this. At a highest 10,000 feet view, what you're really dealing with is a notion of your metadata or your entity, which is essentially what you create and has some semantic to it in terms of what it means to your product. In Confluent's case, it's essentially this cluster, and there is a meaning to what cluster means to us just by the name of it, but it could have some properties, it could have a certain set of state, as part of that. And then you have all these other, data pipelines and data warehouses and real-time analytics that you create. But fundamentally, all they reduce to is this notion of metrics, right? Which is metrics are nothing but some measure on your entities or a set of entities. A good example here is you might have cluster to be your entity, and then production active clusters is essentially a metric that means all the clusters that have more than, let's say, 50 MB per second produced to it is essentially a metric that you're trying to track in terms of a counter, right? You can have more sophisticated metrics. It's pretty obvious to look at, something like each of the organizations have a lot of clusters, and maybe you want to look at all the active organizations, and that is again defined as another metric, which is essentially going to be the number of organizations where the organization is active in terms of the previous definition. And then if you sum them all up, it's essentially a number of organizations that are production active.
So you mentioned earlier that you're thinking about that there should be a really strong concept of data ownership. And I think part of the problem is that right now you have one owner on what you called entity system, which is essentially the production live system where the product runs. And then you have a very different set of owners, like data scientists and data engineers, on your data warehouse. So we're kind of lacking this. There is a person in the org who owns the semantics of a cluster from end to end, essentially, something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, I think an entity or a set of entities have close association with all these metrics that we just talked about. And the metrics can be of two types, if you want to think about it that way, which is something that's very real time, where you really want to show, the SaaS data app example where you're building all these usage metrics in your product can be driven off of this real time metrics. And it has this historical metric where you're trying to look at how many organizations became active in the last 1 year, let's say. And that's essentially a query that you would do on some kind of a data warehouse where you're going and essentially scanning all the past data. But from a user perspective of the system, none of that matters. What matters is you have these entities, you have these metrics, which could be real time or historical, and then you have the association between these two, right? Which is essentially what connects them together. And to me, that is connected through events, right? Which is you have a state, an entity gets created, and it goes through different state transformations, and that happens in your product. And then once that happens, you kind of emit these events that tells you about the global state changes in the platform. And then there are a bunch of metrics that have to get updated, basically because of the state changes and transformations that an entity goes through. And similarly, the other way around, where some changes happen on the metric side. For example, you wanted to kind of update or delete an entity, let's say, because of a metric going above some threshold value. Like in this particular case, you might decide because the cluster was not used for a month, you want to go delete a cluster, right? And
or even just mark it as an inactive org or something along those lines.
So then what happens is the metric object that is tracking the usage, you kind of define a rule on that metric, and you can essentially say on this specific condition being satisfied, go delete this entity, right? But what this gives you is a very powerful semantic of how entities and metrics at a very high level are essentially the very basic way to define a system and a platform, and how events between these entities to metrics and these metrics to entities connect the world. And the reason why this is very powerful is you can now build a platform that consists of these entities and metrics and the communication between these metrics and entities, and a bunch of actions that define some events. And the platform can fundamentally be the central platform that leverages the right underlying data systems to do the right job, but gives a much more simplified experience and significantly reduces the work in a company, right? So the way you would map this to Confluent is you have this platform. Let's assume this the SaaS developers would kind of build their apps on this platform. They'll generate all these entities and they create all these entities, and then they'll be able to look at these metrics, which is automatically available, and kind of build all these dashboards that they wanted on the Confluent website. At the same time, the nice thing about this is you can give access to the other people in the company and just have them get access to whatever data sets and metrics they want. They can define more metrics, like these are derived metrics from existing metrics, right? But it just becomes very powerful because in this model, any breakage on the schema will have a very tight coupling with the metrics. And given you have a platform, the people, the company or the infrastructure that essentially the infrastructure here, the infrastructure that owns the platform can be responsible for making sure none of these breakages happen, because they can build end-to-end observability. They can do all the testing that you need to ensure that a platform works end-to-end.
So you're essentially describing a platform that will tie together what the users are doing, what the business entities, what happens to the business entities as a result, a lot of derived metrics for a lot of business functions, and tying this back into the product where and when it makes sense, and giving everyone engineering product visibility into the whole thing from the customer experience to the business metric as one system.
That's exactly right. So, which is why I'm very particular about calling it as a data platform rather than a data system, because I do think, I've been in this industry for 15, 20 years building these data systems of different types. And I don't think there will ever be a single data system with a single file format that can kind of tackle all your use cases. Now, oftentimes the way systems try to solve this problem with different use cases is by building like n different indexes.
Yeah.
But it is still very, very hard for you to do that because uh, you have very different use cases. Like relational database can never be your real-time analytics system. A real-time analytics database can never be your
Yeah.
data warehouse. And
And
then also the thing that comes up, right, like lake houses, which is essentially trying to push all the data into S3 and trying to build computations on top of that. And they're all, I think, valuable. They all solve use cases, but they also at the same time have this downside where you just built a very complex ecosystem of systems, and a platform that can fundamentally simplify these abstractions around metadata or entities and metrics and events is kind of what we're really dealing with across the board. And if you can tie all of this together, whoever does that really, really well, I think have a really, really good uh, innovation on their hand.
yeah, and I really think that cloud changed a lot, right? Because in the on-prem world, there was actually a benefit to just having Oracle do the whole thing because you had a DBA and you wanted that person to manage the whole thing. In the cloud, as long as there is a good service that you can actually use and rely on, you don't really care how many different file formats and data stores they use behind the scenes. So it's almost like a competitive advantage. The customers, you can basically abstract things that the customers don't care about and give a better product as a result.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And I think it's really hard to do this, obviously, right, for obvious reasons, which is why it's not been done. But I think from a use case and experience perspective for the end developers, I think what you'll end up building is finally a data platform end to end that is owned by developers, and they feel like they have total ownership of it end to end, and they can be responsible to the customers and the business.
And this is very critical because if you think about in modern SaaS companies, who is the person who thinks about system reliability?
Yeah.
It's usually not sales and not marketing who thinks about the systems being highly available. It's the engineers who have this expertise. So
Exactly.
that was exactly the problem with all those different systems picked by different people. Like there was a very famous SaaS that we relied on that had like a weekly 12-hour downtime. And like for engineers, it was like, who the hell buys a product that has 12-hour downtime every week? But a business person could actually pick this up.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, Ram, we are completely running out of time.
Yeah. So I mean, this one thing I want to say is obviously everything looked kind of sad and gloomy, and we obviously talked about a future system. But I did want to mention that finally, though, after all this hard work and years of building pipelines and all of this, we ended up definitely making our customers successful, trying to help with our onboarding and making our other people in the company like sales, marketing, and support all be very happy with the data that they got. It was just that, it was not perfect. So
yeah, I think, and our users didn't care that we had to duct tape it all together. Marketing probably were happy when we ducted it all together. It was really like engineering pain and on call and this kind of situation.
cool.
So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, awesome.
So
Thanks
much once again. It was an incredibly informative session. I would probably recommend to listeners to go back and listen to it 1, 2, 3 more times, especially the last 10 minutes. It was very dense. So I think this is just going to be topics that we will keep coming back to, like engineering a great product and a great experience, really from first principles up.
Yeah, I think bringing SaaS and data together is such an important problem to solve for the future of SaaS. And I think, we'll have more conversations around this. It's pretty exciting topic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, take care. See ya.